All right. Well, thank you everyone so much for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed that profile and hope segment. We have a few more of those to come, which I'm very excited about. Not only am I really excited about this is Celebration of Mental Health in Games event that's happening right now. I'm also super excited about this panel in particular. It's all about mental health in game design. And I cannot wait to dive in. But first, we have a little bit of housekeeping. So, because we'll be discussing a variety of themes around mental health in games and mental health and mental illness overall, a variety of sensitive topics might come up, potentially including subjects like depression, anxiety, suicide, PTSD, and more. If you feel like these topics may be harmful to engage with, then please take care of yourself first. It's okay if you choose to tune into something else. Also, we will make sure that there is time at the end of this segment for the panelists to answer any questions that you might have. So please share any questions in the chat and we're going to do our best to get to them. Okay, let's get started. So I'm Erin Reynolds. My pronouns are she, her. And I am the chief mollusk of Flying Mollusk. That means I'm the creative director and the founder of the studio. And we're most well known for a game called Nevermind. Nevermind's a game that came out a few years ago that narratively addresses topics such as PTSD and psychological trauma. And mechanically, we have some technology that helps players get a sense of when they're getting scared or stressed in the game to help people work through being mindful of stress reactions that they may have so that they may be able to learn how to address them and be calmer out in the world. So I'm really passionate about mental health in games. And so this is why I'm so excited about having all of these amazing people who are here to talk about it more so we can all geek out about it and discuss it. We have an incredible panel of folks who each have different perspectives, backgrounds, and experiences when it comes to game design and mental health. So to start, let's have each of the panelists introduce themselves and provide just a teaser overview of the mental health issues and themes that they've worked on or around in their work. We're going to go in alphabetical order by first name. So we'll start with Connie, then we'll go to Daniel, and then we'll go to Tim. So Connie, we'll start with you.
Hi, my name is Connie. So I'm the founder, writer, creative and art director of my company called Yomai, based in Berlin, Germany. It's very late right now here. And we developed a story-driven emotional adventure game called Sea of Solitude. So Sea of Solitude, its main theme is loneliness. So we portray, we show different types of loneliness and how people experience it, but we also show how friends and family see those who struggle. So it's about a young woman named Kay who's suffering from such strong loneliness that her inner feeling, like the darkness, anger, feeling of worthlessness and hopelessness, turns to the outside and she becomes a monster. And the game is about figuring out why this happened to her and how to turn her back into a human. I can go on forever, but I don't know. We first start small, I think.
Yeah, well, we'll definitely have more time to talk about all of that in depth, and I can't wait to. Put a pin in that for now. Daniel, can you introduce yourself, please?
I'm Daniel Cook. I'm a game designer over at Spryfox. So I've worked on a bunch of different games, Triple Town, Road Not Taken, Realm of the Mad God, a whole bunch of them.
Awesome. And great. Tim, do you mind introducing yourself?
So I have been someone who's worked with a suicide and mental health prevention helpline for a few years now, and I also run a YouTube channel, which I've done a lot of work with mental health and exploring its role in fiction and how we represent it and how we interact with it and exploring those themes, which I find really personal and interesting. That's what I do. I'm HelloFutureMe. That's what you otherwise might know me as.
Awesome. All right. Okay, so that's a great starting point. Let's dive a little bit more deeply into how each of you address each of these issues or topics in your work, and why you tackle these deep and often intense subject matter. So we'll go in reverse alphabetical order for this one. So we'll start with Tim, then we'll go to Daniel, and then Connie.
Sure. So, I mean, the way that I kind of look at mental health representation is I try to take it a step further than a lot of the discussion we see in terms of analyzing books and movies and games of, oh, they represent it negatively, that reflects badly, like going more deeply in terms of looking at games, for example. We can use them as teaching mechanisms to help people develop coping strategies and how effective that is, and games that do that really well. And also the reverse of that is with how we get people to interact with these issues, can we make it worse at the same time? And I've done some work about how when we show, for example, in a game, the method through which someone ends their life, that is a statistically significant indicator of raising risk in people's lives. And likewise, showing people coping mechanisms and helping them learn them and apply them in the game does help them apply it in their own life. So there are significant ways that we can use video game to help develop that sort of thing. And so that's sort of been a big part of what I've been doing, specifically in the video game medium. I've done a lot of other work on fiction more broadly, but we're here to discuss that sort of side. Yeah.
Excellent. Daniel.
For me, I've kind of approached it in two different directions. One is just as expressive art, sort of like when I'm working through something in my life, it's important to talk about it, and sometimes writing it down or making a game out of it is a way of exploring that for myself. The other side of it that I've really gotten into recently in years, over the past few years, is more the positive psychology side of it. We often look at mental health, and we look at sort of the negative sort of emergency outcomes, the depression, anxiety, you're having an attack, you're having an episode. How do we deal with that? How do we support someone? How do we talk about those things such that people have the tools to deal with that? I think there's also a preventative role that games can play. In particular, when you look at strong social support systems where people have their support group, their sympathy group, those 5 to 15 friends that are creating a buffer against a lot of the ups and downs in their life. Games can actually create spaces for people to sort of collaborate, get together, and share those experiences. We've seen a lot going on with Animal Crossing recently, which is this shared social space where people can come together and help one another. And I think there's a whole world of preventative system support places that we can make within games that is sort of a slightly different take than the let's talk about depression and anxiety, which is also important, but it's just two sides of the coin.
Yeah.
Fabulous.
Yeah.
And Connie.
If I...
Oh, sorry, please.
Hey.
Well, here we'll have Connie give her perspective, and then Tim will bounce back to you and hear you.
No, okay, I go first, Tim.
Yeah,
okay.
Go first.
Sure, go.
So Daniel said almost the things I wanted to say. I approach mental health and games or in very artistically. So I didn't plan to make a mental health game. So I went through certain circumstances in my life, and as an artist, I did the one thing that I think we all do, like we wanted to express our feelings. And I, by coincidence, am a game designer, so I put my experience into art, into games. And this is how I approached it. And at first it was simply like writing down what I feel, what I went through, and I talked with friends and family and co-workers, and then I realized that people highly appreciated that I expressed my feelings, that I talked openly about loneliness. It was like people were really like crying often in between. Like, and after the game was released, I met so many people, and hundreds of fans wrote us and just told us that they are so thankful that somebody finally openly talks about this issue. So this is what I feel is like the best thing you can do. Then you have a strong feeling as an artist, as a game designer, put it into your art. There will be people that appreciate that you express these emotions. And this is like the heuristic thing, how I approach game development now. Yeah.
It's beautiful. Okay, and Tim, I know you had a thought you wanted to add on to.
There's a couple of things. So number one, I've played Sea of Solitude and it is a beautiful game to play.
Thank you.
And I wanted to build on what you said about social stuff that games can help people with. There's actually a 2007 study where they looked at people who played World of Warcraft, and it showed that the communities that they built in an online arena through World of Warcraft were really helpful for them to kind of deal with their social difficulties that a lot of them had, and that they emerged from that situation with more skills than they had before. So I thought that was a really interesting point. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
This, we don't have to talk about this too much, but there's been a series of papers we've been working on. The most recent one was honestly on pro-social economics, but one of the things we were looking at was loneliness. And it's fascinating to see like things like television tend to increase loneliness in people as they watch them. But games, out of all the types of media that are out there, do not seem to, particularly the multiplayer games. Even when you're playing these competitive, shoot people in the head games, you think, oh, that seems like it's a negative thing. But what was happening is that you were playing them with friends, and therefore you were improving your support network and your ability to share those moments of disclosure and weakness when those happened. And therefore it was actually overall a supportive effect.
That's fascinating, and especially given kind of where the world is at this time. The subject of loneliness is so, I think, important and something that all of us can relate to in a way that maybe we couldn't relate to as much, or maybe we could, before the pandemic. So, that's fascinating to learn.
Yeah. Yeah, and I when I started to write Sea of Solitude and it became more known, then many other media started to talk about it. Was not because of us. It was like a worldwide move somehow at the same time. Like that in Germany, like a famous football player killed himself because of depression, and that he felt so isolated and lonely. And because of this famous figure, like doing this, like Germany started to talk about it. I know that England now has a ministry for loneliness, like a minister, like just for that. And you need to. I need to look it up, like the exact wording. But it starts like worldwide, not only in games but everywhere, more and more. It's really interesting. Yeah.
That's fascinating. So I guess we, on the topic of kind of, relevance and sort of media, kind of examining these topics in a broader context than perhaps they've been examined before. It feels like, over the past 5 years or so, we've been seeing more game titles that really embrace and examine topics around mental health, either directly or indirectly. So I guess I'd be curious to hear if you think if this is something that's actually a relatively new movement for game design, or maybe it's something that's been happening, for a while, but we're only really just now kind of recognizing these titles. But if it is a new movement, I'd be also curious to hear why you think that might be, or maybe why we're recognizing those titles now more than perhaps we have in the past. Or maybe I'm completely misinterpreting it and I'm totally wrong, which is something I'd be interested in hearing as well. So I guess, why don't we start with Tim on this?
Oh, yeah. Let's ask the person who hasn't developed 2 games. So off the top of the head,
Someone who studies and understands them.
I reckon that it has definitely got something to do with the explosion of the indie game industry, because I mean, I love games, a genre of games called walking simulators. I don't know if is that like a term you guys know?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah, so I love walking simulator games, and like a high proportion of walking simulator games have mental health themes. That's something I've noticed. But all of these walking simulator games, are basically indie games. I don't know of any. I don't think I know of any AAA games or anything like that. So I reckon that's partly where it's come from, and that, you know, games often follow the cultural conversation, which is that we've been slowly expanding it and exploring it and talking about it more over the last 2 decades. You know.
Cool.
Yeah.
Daniel or Connie, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah. So, do you want to go, Connie?
No, go first, please.
So I have the horrible suffering of creating games for like 25 years now. So I sort of have this arc of history in my brain and all the cycles we go through. This is absolutely a new movement. For the longest time, if you looked at sort of the theming of games, there were definitely experimental folks that were doing interesting things. Some of the very early Infocom interactive fiction games dealt with some of these topics. But there's always been this sort of like, games are this copies of media tropes. Like there's sort of like, what's the most generic media tropes, and then we kind of copy it and then slather it onto our games and call that our world. And it was really around 2007, 2008. I think Twine came out in 2009, where you started to get these really low-cost digital distribution platforms where marginalized creators and individuals who just wanted to say something could like speak out. They could get distribution, and they could get an audience, and they could get a community. And that literally did not exist before. I remember in around the turn of the 2000, where consoles had kind of taken over, PC was dying, and there was no space for any sort of voice that wasn't this extremely generic sort of like mass market commercial sort of style of title. And the digital distribution and these low-cost development platforms, and just this wonderful outpouring of sort of new voices really broke this topic open.
Fantastic.
Yeah, so I see it a tiny bit different, but just in terms of the Japanese market. So my company, my co-founder and my friends and many people love Japanese games, so Japanese culture, and their Silent Hill, especially Silent Hill 2. It came out 1999. And it's one of the most disturbing psychological games I ever experienced. It's about like a man that is grieving the death of his wife. And there are several endings, and I don't want to spoil, but it comes out that he himself killed her, and the manifestations of the monsters are like actually that he wants to punish himself. It's deeply psychological, and there are several Japanese games that tackle mental health, but not just maybe just right in your face, like, look, this is mental health, but this is like mental themes that are in between deeply disturbing. And I remember when I was a decade ago, when I played Silent Hill: The Room, I had like, it was so disturbing for me, this psychological effect of being isolated in this room, that I had a mini depressive episode. I needed to stop playing this game. I looked outside of the window, it was sunny and bright, but I felt like the sun had no color and everything went dark, and every people that were laughing didn't mean anything for me. It was just some minutes. but this can show you how deeply affecting, also in a bad way, games can be, because you are this person. It's not like you're consuming, just watching a horror movie. You are in this room, you're playing it, and so I remember it was already like end of the 90s, beginning of 2000s. That's those games, but it was Japanese centric, so it maybe doesn't count. No, it counts, but it's not in America so much. I don't know. How do you go? Nice. Do you guys know Silent Hill or Resident Evil or Persona?
Oh yes.
I have not played any of the Silent Hill games.
Yeah.
Oh, really?
But I think
they're too scary.
The horror genre in particular, I think, does tackle these things. It's not necessarily in the same like authentic, like the artist talking about their experiences sort of way. It's much more. It's filtered through the horror genre in an interesting way. But yes, mostly what I was talking about was very much the Western audience. So I agree with you there.
Connie, you do touch on something that is interesting, though, that I did want to kind of get everyone's thoughts on is, representation of mental health in games. There's a lot of, I think, potential for good, as we've already discussed for that, but there's also a lot of potential for it to maybe be harmful if not treated with the, the right respect or the right way. And so I guess I don't really have a question. I'd just be curious if anyone has any thoughts about that. Like where is that line between it being something good and being something harmful? Is it one size fits all? Is there, as designers, what is our responsibility and our role in that, or as creators as a whole? I guess if anyone has any thoughts to jump in, go for it. Otherwise, we can. Let's see. I know, Tim, you've talked a lot about this in your video. Yeah.
Yeah. I have a lot of complex thoughts on that because I feel like too often when we're critiquing representation in fiction, when it comes to mental health, is that we tend to sort of go to that it's about, if we show that they are violent or we have a villain who is mentally ill, then that by itself is the end of the discussion, that's bad representation. But like mental illness is a lot more complex than that, and exploring kind of the complexities and the difficult relationship between abuse, violence, and stuff like that, I feel is something that requires a more careful look in fiction. Yeah.
Yeah. For our game, like just to mention Sea of Solitude, it was very important that we transport that it's a personal experience, and I just show what I went through and how just to mention it's based on my story partly, the game, and just that we tell the people that it's not like educational or something, but just an experience. We feared so much that people might take it wrong and as a guide how to do it. So it's a fine line that you maybe get people on the wrong feet.
Yeah. Well, one thought I had is as someone who creates this type of work, I worry about the creators. Like there can be a sort of the need for more from the audience. The audience always wants you to expose your darkest, bloodiest wounds to them in the most extreme fashion possible. And there's almost a voyeuristic aspect to some of this. And the process as a creator of digging down deep into your own psyche and sort of like pulling up your viscera and sharing it with the world can be excruciating. It can be very, very wearing. For a player, this world that they're living in it's a 2-hour experience, a 5-hour experience, a 20-hour experience. For the creator who's making this style of work, this sort of like confessional style of work, you are working on this thing for years, like 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, depends on the project. And you are immersed in it and you cannot escape it. And there's always this sort of like the voice of self-critique. Is this intense enough? Is this strong enough? Is this going to convey? And then also, like, how do I protect myself and make this in a safe fashion? And I mean, that's one of the reasons I personally have moved away from that sort of more confessional style of work and more into the preventative sort of like cozier spaces. I find that I can still help people, but it's not as damaging to myself.
Yeah, just so I can completely agree to that. I don't have issues with talking openly about my stuff. I love talking about my issues. I don't know why, but because the feedback is so nice and the conversation. But like developing a game for several years and use it as a grief or as like getting over your issues, you always rip open your wounds again. That was one thing that I encountered. Like I prolonged a little bit my issues because I needed to talk about it all the time and remember the stuff. And so I can agree that on this side it can be very tough to make an art product that takes so long to produce about your issues.
That's a really interesting. I hadn't really considered that before. I only really know that from the perspective of working on fiction and other mediums like books, because all of my books are very much kind of like bringing my personal experiences into the work. But yeah, you're absolutely right. That's something I hadn't really considered before.
Yeah. Do any of you have like any advice for creators who are thinking about sort of bringing that element of themselves into their work? Like, is there anything that you found in creating your own work that was very personal that was helpful in kind of getting you through that, or is it's just tough and that's just sort of the nature of the beast?
Keeping your eye on the lessons, sort of like the positive lessons. Like I approach some of this as like a growth opportunity for myself. Like, and if I can somehow like see the end point and see where the healing occurs, and then say, look, this is the story to that healing. It's more of recounting something towards a positive end goal, as opposed to simply digging yourself deeper and deeper into a pit.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. For me, it's also the feedback again that I got from like all my friends and family. I also deepened the relationship to all of them, like to my family enormously by making this art, and to friends. And so this has helped a lot to finally see for myself that I'm not alone with this feeling. So at the end, it was like the most positive thing that I could do, like going into the open and seeing like I'm not alone. So this was the most positive thing of it all. Like, that brought me through this.
I want to say something briefly about disclosure, which is a common thing that comes up in these type of discussions, because a lot of this is disclosure, where you're being vulnerable. We're being vulnerable, and we're sharing our vulnerabilities with the world, and that is actually one of the best ways of building relationships with others. Like, there's a lot of relationships are based off trust, and when you're willing to trust others and share your vulnerabilities with the world, then they in turn reciprocate and have trust you and share their vulnerabilities, and there's this wonderful positive feedback loop. There's a dark side to all this as well, particularly on social media. Social media is this endless void. And so you find that people disclose, and then there's either no feedback at all, it's silence, which can be crushing in its own right, and or there's negative feedback. And so when you run into either one of those situations, the disclosure can actually be extremely poisonous to the person who disclosed. And so it's always this careful balance. Like, you need to open up and trust people and share. But then in the wrong environments with the wrong set of people, that can be actually extraordinarily damaging. So yeah, it's a messy topic.
Yeah, that's a great point, especially as a game creator too. You're so vulnerable and so exposed to a variety of audiences. It can be really, really difficult.
Yeah, but in my case, it was really weird that there was no negative feedback from people. From journalists, yes, about the game, but from the audience, they were all so nice on Twitter. Like, I have no negative feedback on, and they are all kind. I don't know if it's because I was so open that they all like, okay.
On Twitter?
I know.
Twitter, it's so weird. Twitter is the nicest, the nicest community for me. I'm so sorry. It's really odd. I don't know what it is. We try to analyze it now for a while. That they are all so nice. Yeah, weird.
That's great, though. I mean, there's something kind of beautiful about that. Maybe it is because of sharing that openness, that vulnerability, kind of inspires people to kind of let their social media guards down and be more human, hopefully. I guess so that kind of leads a little bit into something I was hoping I'd have a chance to ask. And I think when making games like this, authenticity is something that's really, really important, when it comes to either designing a game or creating a story about any topic, especially, topics around mental health and mental illness. And so I was curious to get your thoughts on what you think the best practices are for ensuring that when designing a game that touches upon themes of mental health, it is being done with authenticity and being done with respect. Yeah.
I didn't get the question.
I'm gonna let Daniel or Connie feel the question first, because I can't get I got to get my thoughts together.
Sure. Yeah. So basically, I'm just asking, like, or actually, Daniel, it looks like you have some thoughts, so I'll let you jump in.
So I'm a horribly broken person in that what I do is I love to research things and put things into analytical frameworks, which is not the way the most of humanity deals with the world. So for me, when I look at this sort of thing, one of the first things I do is kind of look out there and see, like, what does the data say? Like, what do studies say? Which for a lot of people doing this sort of like, more personal revelation sort of work, that's not the approach that they take at all. Instead, it's more like, here's my raw self and I'm putting it out there. But for me, I like to understand sort of like, what are positive frameworks that we can incorporate into this in terms of like active listening or thinking, like let's self-reflection. How do we think about this topic and find better ways of like, instead of having a violent defense mechanism or transferal of my emotions to somebody else or things like that, how can we instead go and like reflect upon things and pick a more rational choice? And I try to incorporate some of those tools into my writing so that when people encounter it, they at least see the modeling of behaviors that might help them. Because honestly, when you feel a lot of pain, I always worry that I'm just going to be sharing my pain, only my pain with the world. And there is sort of there is a good aspect of that. There is the ability to form relationships and bond, and there's a term for it where you just sort of let it out. I forget what it is right now. But for me, that's like, oh, maybe I can also give these small nuggets of things that are proven to work in terms of therapy or science or whatever it may be. But I know that's kind of a weird approach for a lot of people, so I don't know how widespread it is.
No, that's beautiful. That's great.
You go ahead, Connie.
No. Go first.
All right. So I've talked a little bit about this on my channel, which is I called it the good game problem, which is basically that developing good games or games that are as enjoyable and attractive as possible is sometimes at odds with it being an informative game, a game that actually informs accurately or empathetically the experiences of mental illness. And what I see is that games which tend to do mental illness well often sacrifice elements of what would otherwise be a good game choice. Like, for example, how they use violence in the story is changed in a way that makes it potentially a more informative game, even if it's a less conventionally, you know, I think you described it before as that general, very normal game that was very popular, had to get past the publishers in the early 2000s, like that sort of thing. It's a balance between those two things that are often in tension with one another, which I think it is one of the things that Hellblade did really well, which is that it managed to do violence in a game in a way that inspired empathy for the character rather than painting them as a violent person, which is it's an extra step of care, an extra step of design that in how they incorporate into the game that a lot of games would have struggled with or would have just bypassed completely.
It's great. It's a good point.
Yeah, we tried in Sea of Solitude. We tried to portray like the struggle. There is one level about the type of loneliness from social exclusion, about bullying, and the brother of Kay gets bullied.
Oh yeah, I remember it.
Thank you that you remember. So we wanted to feel that we want to make the player feel helpless in a school, that there are this monster version of the bullies and that you cannot fight them, that you just have to endure what the brother went through who got bullied. But it was so hard. I still think we maybe did it perfectly, because the frustrations for the player were so high when they couldn't like fight back or somehow do something to prevent it. And so this is like an interesting struggle. If you want to portray helplessness, how can you do that without making the player feel frustrated? So there had been tons of those struggles, like when we try to portray certain emotions that are not maybe very common in games, that how do we do that for a player to not feel frustrated by playing it? So yeah, this is one thing. And for me, it's the same as Daniel. Maybe I want to have like the player always to have a positive outlook, something to learn from. So this is what I wanted to, why I tried to portray at the end, like a little like glimpse of how I overcame it. And I hope that people, see like some way how they can overcome their own issues with this little glimpse. I don't know how much I could go in detail, but maybe I can just for a small second, that it's about please. Like that it's not about, that it's not about like that at the end you have this perfect superhero ending, like everyone is happy forever until they die, but I wanted to have like a more realistic approach, that nothing will forever be perfect. You will always have issues in life, up and downs. And I wanted to have this saying like it's okay to be not okay. I think this is a take this like saying also. And this I see that fans, especially because of this ending, that you will always have issues, but that it's okay because we all have that. This is human, and this portrayal, I feel like this is why so many people loved the game also, that it showed a more realistic ending, but positive but realistic. So this is what I want to do from now on, always with games.
It's beautiful. I love it.
I also found it really interesting. I also found it really interesting how at the end of your game, at least this was my reading of it, when basically you're following the person who's struggling throughout the entire game, and then they confront someone else in their life who has caused difficulties for them at the end of the game. And the very end, gives an implication that that person is on their own mental health journey as well, and that that they've got their own sort of their path to follow and struggles to overcome, which we didn't really see, and it kind of gives that nice impression that like we don't know what's going on inside the minds of others, and like we're getting a glimpse into this girl, you know, when we follow her story, but we don't know him and we don't know what he's gone through.
Yeah, with a boyfriend monster. I need to spoil a bit. No? You save so many of those monsters and turn them into humans again, but some you can't save. They need to save themselves, and you make it only worse by trying to fix them, to help them. And this is one of the levels where we show that. Yeah. Yeah.
I think it's so beautiful when the narrative and the mechanic kind of come together to sort of reinforce the story. You know, and I think it's a really good example of that without getting into too many spoilers. Everyone should play the game. So we're going to be going into the Q&A pretty soon. So before we do that, though, I know all of you have been dropping nuggets of gold as far as advice for developers and game creators and story creators throughout this whole discussion. But I wanted to ask specifically if you have any advice for game makers or story makers or content makers as it relates to a lot of what we've been talking about in terms of either telling their own story or telling an authentic story through research or how to approach this, because it's a lot, and it can be a little overwhelming. And I know a lot of people, when they engage in this content, they want to do it right, but it's not always clear how to do that. And so I'd love to kind of hear if you have any words of sage wisdom to pass along to the community about this.
Should I start? Or
Sure, yeah, go. Connie can start.
Okay.
Go for it.
Okay. So my biggest advice, and I failed at it a lot, is to not let yourself be manipulated by others, other opinions. Of course, your coworkers and brainstorming all the time, but if you have like a strong feeling about your creative vision, try to stick with it. Because then it will be unique. And this is what like I said, I failed oftentimes, that because I'm insecure in between, that I thought, okay, maybe the other person is right, and which it's a fine line. Sometimes they are, but like if you have this feeling, this core vision, stick with it, because then it will be unique. And otherwise, you will get like this watered down, I don't know how to say it in English, version of your art. So this is my strongest advice, but it's not meant that you don't listen to anybody ever. But if you have your gut feeling tells you that this is your core vision, like try sticking to it. To say it one more time. Yeah.
Great advice. I love it. Daniel or Tim, do you have any?
I can build off that a little bit, which is find people who support you. So one of the things, as budgets particularly go up, you start to get more and more censorship. You start to get more and more people who say, no, I don't think that would be right. Let's not talk about that. Maybe we should have more hitting people in the head. Like, can we add more blood? Like all the worst sort of commercial instincts are voices that you're going to hear again and again and again. And so you really need to have like people who can support you and say like, look, I know there's people who are going to say these things, but we agreed that this was the vision that we were going to go for. Since we have that agreement up front, let's move forward. And that can save you so much trouble and burden as you go. I want to briefly talk about a failure of mine. So I made a game about not having children, about the various paths in lives that are expected of people, the sort of marriage, have kids, grandkids, all this sort of stuff, and like what it means to not have children. How do you cope with that? How do you deal with that? How do you deal with societal's expectations? And to be honest, I think that probably, 95% of the players completely missed the point. And it wasn't like I was trying to be subtle. The subtext is a thing that, as a general broad population, people struggle with a bit. So sometimes you need to say the thing that you want to say, and then use all your powers to like get that one simple message across again and again and again. Because in general, like we were talking about earlier, this type of game and these type of discussions are relatively new to the audience. People have probably never played a game like this before. And if they have played, if they haven't, they often have expectations of what games are supposed to be saying and how they're supposed to be saying it. You still see things to this day where people are like, no, games don't have messages. What are you talking about, right? And so people are not only like not looking for it, they're actively blocking out any messages you might put in your game. So it actually pays to be a little like blunt at this stage. Like my hope is that as games, like as that audience literacy grows, we'll be able to be a little more nuanced, a little more subtle. And I think within every audience, there's definitely a small group of people who absolutely get it and are willing to read deeply into things. But it's still the nuance, the literacy of talking about this is growing with our audience. It's not 100% there yet.
Those are excellent
I don't know if people
points.
agree with that or
very well said.
with that or not. But.
Totally, completely, totally, 100%.
Yeah, those are both really, really good points. I am not a game designer, but I look at a lot of stories that feature mental illness and how they write them, and I think at the moment a lot of people are really focused on representing the authentic experiences of mental illness, which is fantastic. But a big part of that I've seen is that they show basically only the pain, and they show only the people who are in these circumstances. They mostly show them as people who are suffering. And what I really want to see is people who are mentally ill, helping others, which they do so much. People who, the strengths of people who are mentally ill are not just the things that they're suffering with, but the things that they're also able to do. And not just showing them as victims of circumstance or whatever. That to me, I think, is a big alienation between what we're currently seeing and what I think would be really healthy. So that's what I'm trying to do in my own fiction pieces, basically. Seeing them not as just people that need to be helped, but people that can help others as well.
That's amazing. It's a really, really good point. Yeah.
Yes.
Gosh, thank you everyone for sharing those. Those are all great words of advice, and I hope designers worldwide watching this heed them well. All right, so I'm ready for questions from our viewers, if you all are. Hopefully some will come in shortly. I'm not seeing any yet. Oh, here we go. Let's see. Question is, sorry, my question prompter is covering up the question itself. So let me hope that the UI goes away in a second. There we go. Okay. How do developers of games that deal in mental health balance the content? Like, how do you know how not to take it too far versus not enough to really get the point across? It's a great question.
Yeah, good question. Who can answer that? Daniel?
So whenever someone asks me this, I want to say, like, statistics. There are a distribution of players, right? And for that distribution of players, there's going to be some people who are over here who are able to handle very, very intense content, and there are some people over here who are not able to handle almost anything that has any level of intensity. So there's no one right answer here. You have to do something, and you're going to get some spread of that probability spectrum, and that's just life. Like one of the things that we do a lot is we show things to people and we see if the reactions are the actions that we imagine that we want. And sometimes you can't listen to that because their reactions are heavily, heavily filtered through all sorts of different biases and thought processes. But it gives you a little inkling of like, oh, I'm playing this music for people. Are they hearing what I want them to hear? And you know, it's a rough instrument at best.
Yeah, and with Sea of Solitude, we had such a wide span of people getting it completely, people don't getting it, and we wrote it more right in your face, and it was too right in your face, or the mental health team had been too afraid for people, or people started crying in the test like very early on, or like they were totally like what it's called blunt, like didn't care at all to the whole game. It was like such a wide span that I actually don't know. I don't know how to. You have to at some point be okay that you have like to split the audience maybe here and there. So I still don't have the answer.
Just from my personal background in working with suicide prevention and stuff like that, when it comes to taking it too far in fiction, the only line I'm personally willing to draw is plan means time frame, which is the framework that we work with. They're the three main indicators of risk, basically, for someone at that level. Do they have a plan about how they're going to end their lives? Do they have the means to get that plan in action? And do they have a plan for when they're going to do it, time frame? So there are some games that I've played which have not just told you that someone has ended their life or whatever, but they've taken you through the process of preparing themselves for that end. That to me is too far because that is a significant raising of risk. But exploring the experiences behind that are really to be encouraged. But I'm not really sure that showing people these methods are going to be helpful in any meaningful way.
Great. Thank you for those answers. All right, do we have another viewer question? As we wait, oh, got one. All right. Given all mental health diagnoses have a myriad of manifestations, what tips do you have for portraying mental health challenges in games without attempting a definitive example? That's a good question. No, this one looks is a really juicy one. You have to like think about that one.
Yeah. I have drawn a distinction between there's kind of two different things in fiction that are often at odds with one another: being informative and creating empathy. Those two things are not the same thing. The clearest example of this would be that we're more likely to empathize with people who are attractive than people who are not. So when you've got movies starring Jennifer Lawrence and the other attractive dude, I don't know what it is, his name is, Silver Play Lining Book or something, we're more likely to empathize with those sort of characters, which is a lot of YA that, I read that explores mental health. You get these girls described as they're like a China doll, that sort of thing, or the guys are the bad boy, and yeah. So on the one hand, I think that focusing on how much you are cultivating empathy for the character versus being informative is something to keep in mind. Probably don't, don't only try and create empathy and forsake any sort of informativeness. But at the same time, I think there's definitely a place for fiction that doesn't necessarily fit to the detail, everything that we can possibly come up with when researching mental health. Because, books are fiction in the end. But trying to cultivate a sense of empathy without stepping too far out the bounds of anything close to without stepping too far out bounds of realism. That would probably be my answer there.
Yeah, makes sense.
A lot of it is ends up being taken from either personal experience, because that's where a lot of work comes from. But personal experience, unfortunately, introduces all sorts of wonderful biases into it as well, misunderstandings, etc. One of the things that we've dabbled with, and we probably don't do enough, is sort of reaching out to people who are in a particular group and saying, like, look, what do you think of this? Like, are there experiences that you've had that you would want to see in this, see reflected in this? And that can, for one thing, it's just this wonderful source of those authentic moments. It's like, oh, I would have never thought that this would have been a thing that someone who would be concerned with, and then you bring that into your own work, and I think it makes it more honest. But you know, that also has its own issues. But it's a lot of this is better than nothing, but is not great. I don't know if there's a definitive answer to this one either.
Connie, do you have any thoughts?
I just what Daniel said. It's one-to-one what I would say. So.
Excellent. All right, so we're actually almost at the end, which is hard to believe. This went by so fast, and I feel like we could talk about this for another 3 hours. But alas, they will not let us do that. So in the last couple of minutes, can everyone just share where folks can find their work and continue to be inspired by all the amazing things that you're doing? Let's see. We'll start with Daniel this time, since you got the middle slot in the initial intros.
So spryfox.com. I think at spryfox on Twitter is also. We just announced a new game that we're working on called Cozy Grove, which is a bunch of ghosts who are going through issues, and you kind of have to help them out. It's kind of an Animal Crossing-like game. So if you go to Cozy Grove on Twitter, at Cozy Grove, you can find that.
Awesome. Great. Connie?
The main news by now are coming from my Twitter, which is Connie Geppert, my name. And we are working on a couple of exciting things. Like, we were so busy in the last month, and it will be announced soon. So go to my Twitter for now. We have our website, but I never update that, so just Twitter.
Great. And Tim?
You can find me as HelloFutureMe on YouTube. That's probably the best way to find my work. If you're wanting to see more stuff on mental illness, representation, and fiction, I've got a video on that called The Complex Relationship Between Mental Health and Fiction, which explores things like Third and Reasons Why.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, everyone, for sharing your time and your wisdom and experience. This has been an honor for me to chat with you all, and I hope it was interesting and helpful for everyone watching. So coming up next, we're going to have another Profile in Hope video with the amazing, unique, one-of-a-kind Teddy Deef. I'm really excited to watch this one. And then following that, we will have the Game Awards, which also is very exciting. So thank you so much, everyone, and stay tuned for more amazing Take This celebration in games and mental health. Thank you.